welcome to the session. I think you have a lot of food, but it's time for us food for thought. I know it's very challenging to moderate the first session after a big meal, but nonetheless, we have very interesting themes ahead of us. Two themes, one is about decision making, another is about learning with the cutting edge technology. You may think these two themes are somewhat unrelated, but to me, these are very closely related because, after all, when we decide on something, we always need some kind of information, knowledge, before we take any decision. In UN system, we call it evidence-based approach. By evidence, we mean information, knowledge, etc. You know, knowledge cannot be obtained without learning. So learning with cutting-edge technology will certainly help us to reach a quality decision. So we have a very distinguished speakers from these two related but different areas who can update us about the latest trend, thoughts, and theory. So by the end of the day, if we complete the session, we'll become a better decision maker, we'll be a better learner. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Phil Rosenzweig, Professor, International Institute for Management Development. You know what IMD is, from Switzerland. And next to him, we have Mr. Michael Kanchanapom, half Thai, half Korean, the CEO and founder of Skillshare. I welcome you to this important meeting, and without further ado, may I now invite Mr. Phil Rosenzweig. You have half an hour. Thank you.
So thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. As described, I'm professor at IMD, which is an Institute of Executive Education and Development based in Switzerland. I'm American by birth. One aspect of executive development and the focus of my research has to do with the way that people make decisions. In human resource management, we often hear about so-called war for talent, as if the main challenge that we face is to acquire people who have this thing called talent. That may be true to some extent, but I think that even more important is that we learn to develop the talent of the people already in our companies. And part of that has to do with improving the way that they make decisions. Now, there's already been a lot of research about decision making, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time reviewing that, but then I want to move beyond that as well, because I believe we're now at a time, a very interesting time in the research, where we are able to build upon and extend that work. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about probably the most well-known way of thinking about decision-making we'll call economic rationality. Then I'll spend more time on something called behavioral decision theory. And then I'll spend more time talking about where I think we are in terms of new frontiers of decision-making. So that's the idea for the next number of minutes. The idea of people being rational, the rational actor model, is very well established in the field of economics. It's probably what you learned when you studied economics. It's what I was taught. The idea is that people aren't stupid. They're not wrong. They are able to make good decisions based on their interest. So as shoppers, you buy the quantity you want at the price you want. You make rational decisions. In your job, what job you choose to perform, who you work for, whether you find the pay acceptable or not, all of that works because you are a rational actor. So the notion is very deeply embedded in a market approach to economics. The idea of a free market works in economics when we assume that people are rational. So that's the economic dimension to this. But there's also a social and political dimension to believing that people are rational. And that is that if people are able to make good choices, well, they should be able to vote for candidates. And so the whole notion of electoral democracy also has its origin in this notion that people are rational. So there's a political side and there's an economic side. But beginning some time ago, there were researchers who said, yeah, but you know, people are not entirely rational. The decisions they make do not always conform to the logic of economic theory. And beginning in maybe the 1970s and through the 80s, there were people from the field of psychology and from the field of economics who challenged the idea of economic rationality. What they undertook was a series of studies that now go by the name of behavioral decision theory. Sometimes you hear the word behavioral economics, sometimes you hear the word behavioral finance. The key word there is behavioral. And the idea is, don't tell me what the theory says they should do, show me what their behavior really does do. So some of the names that we associate with that field of behavioral decision theory, fortunately, don't just do academic research, they've also written some popular books, and let me show you some of them. This is perhaps the most famous researcher in the field. This is Daniel Kahneman, and a book he wrote a few years ago called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a very famous book. Maybe many of you have read it. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. His co-researcher for many years was a man named Amos Tversky, who died in 1996, so he didn't get the Nobel Prize, but Kahneman did. Another person very famous in this field is named Richard Thaler. There's Richard Thaler and his book called Nudge. On Monday, I was in downtown Seoul. I went to a bookstore. I saw the Korean version of Nudge. So these are both books that you can find. And here's another one that may interest you that came out not long ago. This is a slightly younger man. His name is Dan Ariely. This book in English, Predictably Irrational, The Hidden Forces That Shape Our Decisions. So if you will see what this research is about in a moment, and one thing I hope you take from this session is it will inspire your curiosity to go out and find some of these books. In any event, the basic idea of behavioral decision theory is that our brains are not all powerful. Human rationality is not infinite. You don't have unlimited processing power between, the bones of your skull. So we refer to what's bounded rationality. And because human rationality is bounded, the human brain relies on shortcuts to reach judgments and decisions. You don't know this is happening, but this is happening unconsciously in your mind. And those heuristics, those shortcuts, are often very good, but sometimes lead to mistakes. And when they predictably lead to mistakes, we call those biases. When Kahneman writes about System 1 and System 2 thinking, System 1 is this very rapid and usually correct, but sometimes incorrect way we make judgments. And System 2 is when you stop and say, let me give this a little more thought and think a little more reflectively. So what Kahneman writes here is the way to block errors that originate in System 1 is simple in principle. Recognize the signs that you are in a cognitive minefield. Slow down and ask for reinforcement from System 2. So the main theme in behavioral decision theory is your brain, although it intends to be rational, is likely to make certain mistakes, and you should guard against them. What kinds of mistakes? Well, there's a long, long list, and I won't go through all of them, but let me just give you a few examples, and I hope it will interest you, but it will also show you why I think we need now to go to a new frontier. Here's an experiment. You ask a number of people this: which camera would you prefer? The Minolta S1 for $269.99, rated 6 out of 10, or the Minolta S2, twice as expensive, $539, rated 8 out of 10. I asked this of 69 people. This is based on an experiment, by the way, of Amos Tversky. There's no right or wrong answer, but when I ran this with 69 people, I got 42 who said they wanted the S1, 27 who wanted the S2. Very well. To an entirely separate group of people, unrelated to these 69, I asked them to choose, but not just the S1 and the S2. I now also added the S3. The S3 is priced at $839.99, rated 7 out of 10. What happens when we add the S3? When there's only the S1 and the S2, it was 42 to 27. What happens when you add the S3? Well, how many people go for the S3? Not very many. Sometimes nobody. This time, I got 3 people who wanted the S3. Some people will pay the most expensive for anything. But the interesting thing that happens is there's now a shift between the S1 and the S2. And the S2 now gets much more preference. To a conventional economist, this is irrational. They say, the fact that you add the S3 that most people do not want should not change the preference between the S1 and the S2, but it does, for what we call the framing of choice. Because the first time, the S2 was the more expensive, and people said, ooh, I don't want to pay the most. But now that you add the S3 is not the more expensive option, it seems like the reasonable middle option. Is this an important finding? Yes. It's important if you're in the sales and marketing business, because you can change the way people make decisions based on the framing of options. It's very important if you're a shopper, which everybody here is. You can be manipulated into preferring things simply by the framing of choice. So this is one example that I give you. I'll give you another one now. This is about something we call mental accounting. So here's the idea. You're going to spend $30 for a watch strap, like this one or this one. As you reach for your wallet, the sales associate tells you the same strap is on sale for $10 at another branch of the store 20 minutes away. Would you buy the strap here, or would you go to the other store and save $20? What would you do? So I asked this of a number of people, 139 people, and here what we had was 52 said, I'll buy it here. 87 said, I'm not going to buy it here for $30. I will go 20 minutes and buy it for 10. Very well. That's one group of people. Then to a separate group of people, I ask a question not about a watch strap, but now I ask about a luxury watch like this one or this one for $1,889. As you reach for your wallet, the sales associate tells you the same watch is on sale for $1,869 at another branch of the store 20 minutes away. Would you buy it here, or would you go to the other store? Now, an economist would look at these two questions and say, they're the same question. In both cases, you can save $20 by walking 20 minutes. But are they the same question? Is the answer going to be the same? The first one, the answer was 52 bought it here, 87 went to the other store. But this time, what do you think? Now what we find is that 109 buy it here, only 31 go to the other store. Now you can do this at home, you can do this with your friends. The numbers will be a little bit different, but not very much. I think it will be pretty consistent. To an economist, this is an irrational result. There should be no difference between the watch strap and the watch. But of course there's a big difference. Because you do not simply make decisions saying, do I want to spend 20 minutes to save $20? You think about the proportion. You think about the fraction. With the watch, it's a very small fraction saving. For the strap, it's very big. Now, I'm not going to give you more examples, but there are many more. I think you will find them to be very interesting. They're entertaining. They're surprising. You will read some of these and say, oh, other people might make those mistakes, but not me. You will be surprised. You make them as well. So it's very entertaining. It's very enlightening. But I want to tell you that as good as this research is, we have to be a little bit careful. Because what do these experiments do? Here's a quote from Dan Ariely, cognitive psychologist, does outstanding work. He says, for social scientists, experiments are like microscopes or strobe lights, magnifying and illuminating the complex multiple forces that simultaneously exert their influences on us. They help us slow behavior down to a frame-by-frame narration of events, isolate individual factors, and examine them carefully in more detail. What he's saying is, if you want to do good scientific research about cognition, experiments are very useful. And you know what? He's absolutely right. They're how you get the same question posed to different people. You rapidly get neat results that are statistically powerful. However, the power of experiments comes at a cost. These experiments that I've shown you, and there's a much longer list, share a number of factors. First of all, you can choose which camera you want. You can choose to buy here or go there if it's the strap or the watch. But what you could not do is you could not alter or improve the options. For the cameras, you couldn't say, can I see a Canon or a Nikon? Or what happens if I change a lens? You can't do that. You can pick the one you want, but you can't improve it, nor can you change the price. Similarly, for the watch or the watch strap, you can buy it here, you can go there, but you can't improve the terms. Think for yourself, what would you do if somebody said, you can pay $30 here or go 20 minutes for 10? What would you probably do? I know what I would do. I would say, how about I buy it here for 20? Let's split the difference. Or maybe I would say, how about you go get it, bring it here, and tomorrow I will buy it here for 10. There are many things that we would do in our daily lives, but in experiments like this, you're typically not allowed to do it, number one. Number two, whether it's consumer choice or something else, typically you are asked, what is the decision you prefer for yourself, never mind anybody else. There's no competition. You're not trying to do better for you than they're trying to do for them. Third thing is that what makes these experiments wonderful is I give you the question, you give me the answer right away, very fast cycle time. What that means, however, is we tend to study decisions that take place very, very quickly. That's good for experiments, but be careful. I'll show you in a minute why that's a limitation. And the last point is you are making the decision as an individual. Nobody's watching you. Nobody is saying, ooh, last week you did this. Why are you doing this now? If you do this today, are you going to do it again in the future? Nobody is looking at you to see about your behavior. Are you credible or anything like that? The importance of this is these experiments have been fantastic to unlock some of the mechanics of cognition, and they are very, very useful for many kinds of decisions. They can be generalized to decisions like shopping, many kinds of shopping, to investing, if you buy mutual funds or things like this, but we must be very careful when we try to apply them to other kinds of decisions, because I will tell you managerial decisions are different in all four of these respects. Number one, managers don't just say, I'd like this one or that one. They can influence outcomes. That's what management is about. Management is about improving performance, shaping outcomes, getting things done that otherwise might not be done. The mark of a good manager is precisely his or her ability to shape and transform events, which you don't find in most of these experiments. Point number two, often, not always, but often, managerial decisions are made with an eye towards competition. Performance is not absolute, it's relative. Just last week, I was reading the results of Samsung. Samsung is in a competitive battle, not just with Apple, but with Huawei or with Xiaomi. It is making choices based on its relative performance with rivals. Point three, many of the most important managerial decisions are not, do you want to buy this or that, or something that happens immediately, but they take place over time, entering a new market, releasing a new product, expanding capacity. You may not get the feedback for quite a bit of time. In fact, you may have the responsibility to make a second decision before you even know the results of the first. And the last point I would make about managerial decisions is management is necessarily, inevitably, a social function. There are people in your organization watching you. They're saying, ooh, last time you did this, now you're doing this. Which is it? You want to be consistent. You want to be credible. Matters of reputation matter. So one of the problems that we have is we're doing a lot of very good research for the right reasons that conforms to certain constraints in experiments, but be very careful if we try to generalize. Now, I'm going to give you just one example about how we can shape outcomes. Now, this is Korea, so I expect there are many people here who either play golf or appreciate golf. Let me show you something here that maybe you're familiar with. This is the well-known Ebbinghaus illusion, named after Hermann Ebbinghaus, a German psychologist from many, many years ago. The question, of course, is, which of the orange circles is bigger? Now, if you know this, you say, well, actually, they're the same size. Yes, they are the same size, but they don't look the same, do they? I don't think so. In fact, you can stare at this for a long time. You can tell yourself they're the same size. They don't look the same. The one on the right, surrounded by many small circles, looks big. And the one on the left, surrounded by a few very big circles, looks small. Why is this important? There was an experiment done a little while ago that involved the game of golf. And we took people, not we, but these researchers took people, not professional golfers, but average people, people like yourself, maybe weekend golfers, and they had them do an experiment that involved putting from a distance of about 3 meters. Now, what you don't see in this photograph is the researchers over the hole had a projector that was shining lights down vertically, and those lights were creating circles around the golf hole. Standard size golf hole, standard size golf ball. For half of the people, it was casting many small circles that made the hole look big. For the other half of the people, it was casting some very large circles that made the hole look small. And the research question was, do you think it made a difference on how many balls they were able to sink in the hole? And the answer was yes. It made a big difference. In fact, for the people who were aiming at the one that looked small, they got about 4 out of 20. For the other one, it was about 8 out of 20. Now, if you're a golfer, let me give you the bad news, because I know what you're thinking. You're saying, next time I go play golf, I'm going to take a projector with me, and I'll shine lights, and it'll make the hole look bigger. And the bad news is they won't let you do that. Can't do it. But you can do the next best thing. And you know from sports psychology, from visualization, that if when you're standing aiming that putt, you can imagine many little circles that make the hole look big, that can be useful. There's a whole field of visualization and sports psychology, not just for golf, not just imagining a great shot, but in basketball, in track and field, in many, many things. The fact is that to some extent, not without limit, but to some extent, when you have the ability to influence outcomes, holding a high level of confidence can lead to somewhat improved behavior. And if you were with me this morning for the first presentation by Jim Yong Kim, it's one of the first things he said. He says, you know, he learned that when people say something is impossible, I jump in. I make things happen. When he was told he couldn't apply for certain funds, let's do what we can to influence outcomes. Whether it's that or whether it's the golf, nobody said, do you want to sink 8 or do you want to sink 4? You actually have to make it happen. You have to hold the club, hold yourself properly, hit the ball with the right speed, the right force, the right direction to make it happen. It's not quite like management, but management also involves influencing outcomes. And when you're influencing outcomes, just as Mr. Kim said this morning, to believe you can do something, to not settle for something small and unambitious, but to do something large and ambitious can actually improve outcomes. And this is very important because most of the experiments we've looked at, you cannot influence outcomes. So we're told, watch out for these biases, you never want to be incorrect. But when you can influence outcomes, it can, to an extent, be helpful. So, where does all this go? I took these ideas and put them together in an article that I'll talk about and a book that's just come out. And you see the title here, What Makes Strategic Decisions Different? And then it says you have to know what kind of decision you're making in order to make it well. So I believe we're now at a third phase of thinking about decision making that takes us beyond rational and beyond behavioral decision theory to say the next stage is to understand that you in your lives and the people working with you in your companies do not just make one kind of decision. You make many different kinds of decisions. And I give you 4 basic kinds here. The 2 dimensions of this matrix, the horizontal dimension is whether you can influence or control outcomes. On the left, no, this is, do I want this camera or that one? I can make the choice, but I can't actually change the terms. On the right, where control is high, that's like putting the golf ball in the hole. You have to make that happen. The vertical axis asks whether performance is absolute. That means, are you trying to do well, never mind anybody else? Or are you trying to do better than a rival in a competitive situation? And they come together by thinking about 4 fields of decision making. The lower left is where the experiments I have shown you tend to exist. The great majority of research about cognitive psychology and decision making is firmly in the lower left. You can make a choice or a judgment, but you can't influence outcomes, and you're not worried about anybody else. And for that, as our colleagues have said, you want to watch out for cognitive minefields and, invoke your system too. But in the lower right, when you can influence outcomes, this is like the golf, you want to think positively, even having a somewhat elevated sense of what you can achieve. It's only by doing that that you'll be successful, as we heard from Mr. Kim this morning when he said, I'm going to ask for the 40 million. The vertical dimension, the upper left is where we see a lot of game theory. If you heard Mr. Gottman this morning, he had that matrix of payoffs. It involves competition, but you can't change outcomes. But the more important is the upper right. The upper right is where I believe many of the most important strategic decisions take place. You are not simply making a choice, do I want this or that? You have to make it happen, which means influence is high, and you have to try to outperform rivals who are trying to outperform you. When Samsung comes out with its new handset, it's very much an upper right decision. And my point is, you cannot simply take the findings of behavioral decision theory to understand that. So, there is what I would say is a curious paradox. The first field in the lower left is the ideal place to study human cognition. So I have no complaint about the cognitive psychologists who do these very nice experiments. That's exactly what they should do, as Dan Ariely said. And the results are very applicable for many kinds of decisions. Shopping decisions. If I buy and sell financial assets, I can buy a share of Google, I can buy a share of IBM, but I cannot inspire it to do any better. So positive thinking doesn't matter, and there's no dimension of rivalry. However, be very careful about applying those findings to other settings, in particular to the upper right. So when we are dealing with strategic decisions, when we are motivating people, leading them, shaping their behavior, inspiring them, when you are undertaking a task, you are not simply choosing this or that, you have to make it happen, and not just in golf. Executing a project, giving a presentation, playing the piano. Many, many things in life are not simply a matter of making a judgment or choice about things you cannot influence. You must make them happen. And so When we can directly influence outcomes, positive thinking, even holding a level of self-belief that is somewhat elevated, can actually be useful. It can help us improve performance. You know this if you're a leader in an organization. We often try to inspire or motivate people. Yes, you can do it. Come on, let's do something we haven't done before. Let's set our sights high. It's what Mr. Kim was saying. And when we overlay the competitive dimension, when performance is relative and maybe even highly skewed, by which I mean it's winner take all or a very few winners and many losers, to have a somewhat elevated sense of what we're able to do is not only useful, it can actually be essential. And so I believe that keys to making better decisions, first of all, one thing I would leave you with, and this is for you individually, but also as you think about the human resources in your organization, there is not just one kind of decision that we make. And a first step is to discern what kind of decision you're facing. Is it a lower left? Is it a lower right? Is it an upper right? And then the next point here is to develop the versatility to respond differently to different kinds of decisions. When you're out shopping, positive thinking doesn't matter. I can't change what's in front of me. But when I'm leading a team or when I'm competing with another firm, those things must come into play. So discerning how decisions differ and then developing in yourself and in the people in your organization the capacity to respond differently to different kinds is, I think, a very important next step for making better decisions. If we are only thinking about that lower left quadrant, yes, we want to avoid biases, and that's what I refer to as left brain thinking. Rational, dispassionate, no errors. But when we have to think about doing things that have not been done before, when we have to achieve things that are maybe unprecedented, then a different mindset is needed. Simply avoiding errors and being conservative or careful will not result in doing things that are new and unprecedented, a little bit as we heard this morning. So for that, what I refer to as this rational left brain thinking is not enough, and I use the term here, right stuff. So where does that phrase come from? And I'll show you in a moment. My book has been translated into Korean. I think that the translators maybe had a little difficulty with this idea of right stuff. It's a phrase that I think most Americans understand, but let me say a bit of word about it. Where does this idea of right stuff come from? It came from a book that was written by a man named Tom Wolfe, who wrote about the American manned space program in the 1960s and 70s. So you see the astronauts in the top, the book cover, the original one's in the lower right, and you don't see astronauts there, but you see a very fast airplane. Most of the astronauts were first military pilots, many of them were test pilots. What kind of person does it take to be a great test pilot? Well, it takes somebody who's got a lot of courage and has a hard-to-define quality that they call the right stuff. What does it mean? It's a willingness to undertake new challenges and to achieve new levels of performance, things that have never been done before. It is not the same as simply being willing to take very high risks. You can take foolish risks. Foolish risks is not the right stuff. But to assess risks carefully, yet be willing to push boundaries, to say, let's do things that have not been done before to expand our capabilities. To do that, you must have a level of self-belief that is perhaps a bit elevated, but without that, you will not achieve things that have not been done before. So what I write about in this book is that what we need for many kinds of decisions, not shopping, not certain investing, is the ability to combine the left brain and the right stuff. So this is the book that has come out in Korean. You will know what this means better than I. I have a good friend who is professor at Korea University. He said it's a good translation, but they had a little bit of trouble with the phrase, the right stuff. you will know a little bit more now of what this means. But what I'm concluding with is that I'm a very big appreciative supporter of the work in behavioral decision theory. But I believe we are now moving to a third stage. So just to summarize what I think this means for human resources, this is not a presentation only about executive decisions. If we are talking about improved human resources, we are talking about an ability to make better decisions throughout the organization. It is crucial at all levels, not just executive. Of course, I strongly encourage you to read behavioral decision theory and understand the nature of cognitive biases. But even more important is to recognize that there's not just one kind of decision out there, and there's not just one way that you should make those decisions. So they vary, and we need to discern that, and then we need to be able to respond with versatility. This notion of saying, let's get beyond just errors, but to say how decisions differ and how we can build the capability to respond credibly, effectively to different kinds of decisions, I tell you today, is the next stage of our thinking about decision making in a way that is useful for human resources in our organization. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Rosenzweig, for your very informative and educational presentation. It's very, very useful, I find. But I do have some questions later on. Now, as I promised, can we now turn to another but related topic, connected learning. For that, I would invite Mr. Michael Kanchanapon. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? So you have about half an hour, so that we'll have perhaps 20 to 30 minutes for interaction between us and the floor. Thank you.
So I'm very excited to be here. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you for the invite. And it's a very special moment for me because I haven't been back to Korea in over 20 years since I moved to the United States. So I'm going to go over a couple key stories over the past 20 years, but a question that I've been asking myself that I've been trying to answer ever since I left Korea was the question around what's the difference between education and learning, and also what is the most important thing that you can learn to be successful, not only in your professional life, but also in your personal life as well. So what I'll do today is I'm going to share 3 stories that help answer this question for me over the past 20 years. The first story is going to be around education. The second story is going to be around learning and creativity. And the third story is going to be around connecting the dots. So I grew up in Seoul, not too far from here. I actually grew up in Itaewon, so my mom's Korean and my dad's from Thailand. And as you guys know, in the Korean culture, education is a very, very important part of the culture, part of being successful, just part of growing up. So my parents thought it would be really important for me to move to the US to go to a really good university. So they packed our bags, and when I was 10 years old, we moved from Itaewon to Virginia. And I would say everything from the 5th grade all the way until I graduated high school was really centered around one thing, and that only one thing was going to college. Almost nothing else mattered. So every test that I took, every extracurricular activity, pretty much everything I centered was around the application and getting into university. So long story short, from the 5th grade to the 12th grade, I worked really hard. I studied. I did very well in the SATs, and I got into the University of Virginia, which at the time was the #1 rated public school in the entire university, or in the country. And sometimes I joke with my mom that I think she actually moved us to the United States to go to University of Virginia, and she moved us to Virginia because they have in-state tuition, which is probably like 1/10 of the cost of what it usually costs. So I joke with her that she already had this already in mind for 20 plus years. And I got a great education at University of Virginia. I would say that I learned a lot. It was a great experience, and everything for me really accumulated into that experience. But the interesting thing about the University of Virginia, when I graduated, I remember it was a very clear day. It was like May of 2004. My parents were there. It was such a happy moment for me and for my family, because everything we worked so hard for really led up to this moment. And when I walked across the stage, I looked very, very similar to this. I walked, got my diploma, thanked everyone, and walked off. What I realized is that everything that I worked so hard for kind of led to that moment, but there wasn't like this huge pot of gold, waiting at the end of that journey. There wasn't hundreds of jobs offered to me around something I actually wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I realized at that moment that everything in my life was really centered around reaching this finish line. And I was so focused on reaching this finish line that I actually didn't really learn anything. And that's when a huge realization came to me, which is on the difference between education and learning. And I believe that education is kind of what someone tells you to do, and learning is what you do for yourself. And it took me a very long time to really understand that distinction. So when I graduated from the University of Virginia, not only did not have this huge pot of gold, I also had a lot of student loans that I had to pay back, which also was pretty unfortunate. So when I moved on from college, I decided to do something the polar opposite. I said at that moment, what I really want to focus on is learning, and I really want to be equipped with the skills to be successful. I looked at a lot of my idols, out in the real world. I wanted, to emulate and be like them, but I didn't really feel like I really learned anything up until that point. I learned a lot of how to take tests. I learned a lot how to cram. I learned how to memorize. I learned pretty much anything you needed to do to get that diploma. But I really felt like that diploma wouldn't really transfer into the real world, which is when I applied to this school called the VCU Brand Center. And this was a very, very unique learning experience for myself. It was a very non-traditional school. So we never had tests or quizzes. I never really had to cram or memorize anything anymore. I never had to buy a textbook when I went to this school at all either. And all of my teachers were very, very well known within the industry. So I had teachers that helped create the brand Nike, the creative director, the first creative director for Nike, and all of my other teachers were real life practitioners as well. And one of my favorite stories from this experience is, on the very first day of class, we walked into an auditorium that looked just like this. And this guy named Fenske walked up to the front of the classroom. He looked a little hungover. He looked kind of like he didn't want to be there. And he just came up in front of everyone. He just said one word. And that word was just gum. He just said gum. That's it. He said everyone in this room has 1 week to come out with one creative idea that you have to present to me and the rest of this classroom in 60 seconds or less. And he just walked out. He just kind of went back and left. And I remember sitting in the class that day, and I was like, this is really weird. I've never had to do this before. Usually I get a criteria that said, write an essay, 500 words that argues this side over that side, and you have to submit it at the end, and you'll get graded appropriately. And for me, this was a very different experience. And I looked around the room. I looked to my left. I looked to my right. And I'm realizing that everyone else there was kind of confused too. So over the next week, it was really interesting. The first couple of days, no one really knew what to do. We didn't know if he meant chewing gum. We didn't know if he meant actually gums in our mouth. We didn't know if he meant gum for inventing new things. We actually didn't know what he meant at all. So that took a couple of days. And then when we realized the deadline was coming up, we had a couple of days left in order for us to hit this deadline, that's when people really started working. And I think that's when I saw some of the most creative work I've ever seen in my entire life. So when we got back to that class that day, I saw one of the students went up to the front of the room and he tried to break the world record for the biggest bubble. I saw another student go around school and scrape off all the gum below the desk to create a sculpture. I saw lots of different types of work like this. And throughout that moment, I realized that this was a very different way to learn, and it could be a great way to learn as well. And when I walked out of that class, what I realized is, the teacher wasn't really teaching us about gum, nor was he really teaching us, how to be, creative artists. He was just really exercising that part of the brain that we never used before. And because of the traditional education system, which, I believe teaches you to be less creative because it's a one-size-fits-all, this was a learning experience where it was trying to have you be really creative and give you a very unique experience. So throughout the rest of those 2 years I spent at the VCU Brand Center, what I realized is that there are many different ways to learn, and the way they taught it was very different. Like I said, we never had tests or quizzes. All the classes were project-based, so it was very centered on learning by doing. It was all around collaboration versus competition. And when I graduated from VCU, when I walked back across the stage, just like this, to get my diploma, when I walked off, I did feel like I actually learned something. And I felt like I came into the school feeling that I was not that creative, not that innovative, and I walked off that stage. I felt that I had all the skills to go out and just change the world. And I viewed the world very, very differently. I never looked at things as what they could be or what they were, but I always looked at things as what they could be, what I could make, and what I could change. And I felt like I got a new way to view the world, and I was equipped with those skills to go out and do them as well. So when I graduated from VCU, I think the biggest thing that I learned were all these soft skills that were so critical in order to become really successful, which is really around the notion of creativity. And throughout that experience, I really learned 3 things around creativity that I didn't know before I came in. And the first one was that creativity is not about art. It's not about artists. It's not about being really creative and being able to go out and make art and show anything visually or through design. I think what I learned at the school was really around problem solving, and it was really a mindset and a way of thinking that I think could be applied to pretty much any industry. It could be applied to medicine, to entrepreneurship. For that school, was, their canvas was advertising, but I think it definitely can be applied to anything. The second thing that I learned is that anybody can be creative. I truly believe it's not something that you're born with, but it's like a muscle and skill that you develop over time. I came into that school thinking I was the least creative person, and when I graduated, I felt like I was the most creative. And just also reminds me of a story I heard a couple years ago from this guy named Chad Hurley. And Chad Hurley was one of the first designers at at PayPal. And he felt like when he got his first job, he was just there to design the website. And after PayPal got acquired, I remember reading this article that said he felt like he was just the most creative and innovative person in the world from his experience working at PayPal and be able to solve any problem, be able to work with the team and collaborate, being a very innovative culture that when he left, he felt like he could do anything. So, he came into PayPal being a designer, and when he left, he actually co-founded YouTube, which, as you guys know, is one of the biggest websites on the planet. And I think it's because he learned all those skills. He probably already had them, but he also developed them when he was at PayPal. And the unique thing about this story is that it's just not Chad. There were actually 25 to 50 of the first employees at PayPal ended up going out and starting a lot of other companies. They're actually called the PayPal Mafia. So, there's a guy named Elon Musk, as you guys know, that started Tesla and SpaceX. 2 of the other guys started Yelp. Peter Thiel was the CEO of PayPal that ended up becoming the first investor into Facebook. Reid Hoffman started LinkedIn. The story goes on and on and on. Just regular people, at PayPal leaving thinking they could really change the world because they were equipped with these skills around creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and just executing and doing. So the second point is that everybody is creative, and whether you believe that you're creative or not, obviously some people are more creative than others. It's something, and it's a skill that is developed like any other skill. And the third thing, and I think this is the biggest realization I had when I was at the VCU Brand Center, is that it could definitely be taught. I think a lot of people think that creativity and innovation are very hard skills to teach and to learn as a student. But through my experience at VCU, what I learned is that it could be taught, but it's taught in a very different way. one of the key ways it's taught is that it's all through learning by doing. So they actually threw out any notions of traditional academia and replaced that with actually just going out and doing. This is also a known principle at the Stanford D School, which was created by the founders of IDEO, where their tagline is innovators, not innovation, and where everything is around creating and making, because they believe that's the best way to learn how to exercise that skill. So my key takeaway from VCU is that I walked away with the critical skills around creativity, innovation, collaboration, execution that really allowed me to view the world differently and go out and create something, which leads me to the third story around connecting the dots. So after I graduated from the VCU Brand Center, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and I really wanted to do something and give back to the world. So like many of you in the audience, I wanted to find some sense of purpose in what I did. So I spent about a year volunteering in New Orleans. And one of the places I volunteered at was the Langston Hughes Charter School. So for those that don't know that, New Orleans had a very, very terrible educational system. So they had about an 80% high school dropout rate. So 8 out of every 10 students from kindergarten to their senior year will end up dropping out. And what ended up happening is that they started creating these charter schools to reverse that into an 80% graduation rate, college graduation rate. So very, very, very ambitious goal. And for those of you that don't know, the charter school system is essentially a new type of educational reform that's happening in the United States that allows principals and administrators to experiment with many different forms of teaching and learning as long as their students pass the tests, for excellence into getting to the next grade. So Langston Hughes was one of those schools where I volunteered. I remember when I was volunteering there, we took about 3 of the students to a basketball game. So there's a lot of things we did there, but one of my favorite experiences and memories is taking a lot of these students and really getting to know them. And I remember we were in the car, and I turned around and I asked one of the students, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'm just curious to hear. Your entire city got destroyed by a hurricane. Your family's rebuilding. You're in a brand new school with new people. I can understand that you're going through a lot of change, but what do you want to be when you grow up? He answered very, very quickly. He said, I wanted to be a trumpet player. And I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing for a 10-year-old kid to say that so quickly with so much conviction. And it reminded me a lot of when I was 10 years old, when my parents moved us from here in Seoul to Virginia just to go to school. And the thing where I felt a little uncomfortable was, this is a student that, maybe he doesn't become a trumpet player, maybe he becomes something else, but today that's what he wants to become. And he's going to go through this traditional educational system that will teach him how to take tests, will teach him how to get in college, which will pretty much put him on a very different path from what he wants to be. And maybe he can learn how to become the best trumpet player in the world, but maybe he'll learn creativity, maybe he'll learn all these other soft skills that might not exist. And that's where I started connecting all the dots of, could we create something that resembled my experience at VCU that taught creativity and innovation, all these other skills, as something very complementary to the traditional academia and educational system. And that's what led to the formation and the creation, eventually of Skillshare. So a couple of years later, after I moved back from New Orleans, we started thinking about, what could we create that would really combine all these principles together. So when we started thinking about Skillshare, we had 3 big fundamental beliefs around what needed to be created. And the first belief was that education, we believe, is the biggest equalizer. So it doesn't really matter where you're from, your society, what social class, how much money you have. The only thing that matters is that if you continue to educate and learn, it really allows you to have access to a lot of opportunities that you might not have had before. And with that fundamental belief, we said one of the first principles for when we, for Skillshare and what we needed to create was that, It needed to be universally accessible to every single person on the planet, no matter where they're from, how old they are, how much money they had. As long as it was free to them, they can continuously learn and educate themselves in this new type of learning that didn't exist before. The second big principle we had around the creation of Skillshare is that it needed to be open and relevant as well. So we knew that for a lot of these skills that were getting developed in real time, by the time it reached a traditional university, it would be a little outdated, mostly because the world was moving so fast. So, for example, one of our teachers is a guy that teaches a class on 3D printing, which he ended up teaching right as soon as that trend went off. I mean, he taught the very first class, I think, on the internet around 3D printing and how that works and how you can go out and do that on your own. But if you think about what would happen in traditional academia, it might take 3 to 5 years for that to actually hit, let's say, Harvard's curriculum as something that's relevant for the world. So the second big principle we had is that it had to be completely open, and what we mean by that is that anyone can teach. And it shouldn't be restricted to a small select group of people, and it's because everybody has something to share, everyone has knowledge, everyone has skills, everyone has experience that they could teach to other people, and it would be really unfortunate if that knowledge didn't get shared. And the third thing is really around the notion of creativity and teaching the building block to creativity, really based on the experiences I had at VCU. With those three principles in mind, it led to what Skillshare is today, which is a completely free and open platform that allows anyone to teach. It allows any students to take any class for anywhere in the world. We have thousands of classes. We have close to 1 million students taking classes as well. And some of our teachers include real-world experts and practitioners. One of my favorite teachers is Young Gru, who is Jay-Z's music engineer who teaches a class on music production. We have another teacher named Seth Godin, who's a really well-known author on marketing who teaches the class as well. But one of my favorite stories is around a teacher named Jeff Staple, who's in this picture as well. Jeff Staple, is a college dropout, but he went off and started one of the most well-known fashion brands that outside of New York, and he's heralded as the guy that helped really create the whole streetwear fashion movement that never existed before. And when I got introduced to Jeff Staple, he just thought Skillshare was such an amazing concept because he felt that he had so much knowledge in his head that he never got an opportunity to share because, he always went back to his alma mater to ask them if he could just teach, and he would do it for free, and they always turned him down. So he ended up deciding to teach on Skillshare, and he taught a class on fashion design and how to start your own fashion company. And he had a student named Matthew Kaiser, who was from South Africa. And when we interviewed Matthew after the class, we found some really interesting things about him. He also never went to college because he couldn't afford it. But he looked at the opportunity to learn from Jeff Staple, which is one of his idols, as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So he enrolled in the class, for $10, and he got to learn from Jeff. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of students that enroll in this class as well. This class was project-based, much like the experience I had at VCU. So everything was about learning by doing. And the project for this class was uploading your first, what they called tech pack, or your lookbook for your fashion brand. So Matthew had to come up with a logo and a name and some initial designs, and he kind of uploaded it to the website. He got lots of feedback from other students from all over the world. So this class has students from South Africa, from Korea, from Japan, Tokyo, New York, LA, Paris, Stockholm, and he was interacting with all these students. And Jeff Staple picked the top 10 students to fly to New York to have an in-person workshop with him. So these 10 students, Matthew was one of them, came to New York. And from there, Jeff found such love with the work that Matthew did as one of his top students, he ended up carrying his line in his store in New York called Read Space, and Matthew ended up moving here to Seoul to start his company. And it all just started with one very, very, very simple class that he took on Skillshare, which was not universally accessible to him previously because of his location and his price across an area that's not widely taught. And for us, that is a great accumulation of what we wanted to achieve with Skillshare and where we wanted, what we wanted people to learn with the open platform as well. So I would say in conclusion, one of the most fundamental things that we talk about internally is we always talk about the greatest creators in our lifetime in the world. So we talk about Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, obviously because we're in the tech space, so we always admire them. And what we've noticed with a lot of these creators is that they never really followed a traditional education path. Not to say it's the wrong path, not to say it's the right path, but what they chose was a very different path that complemented that, which is really centered around curiosity and the willingness to continue to learn throughout their entire life. And with that fundamental belief, we really believe that, if you really believe that everybody is creative, it can be learned, it can be taught, and if you combine that with education, great things can happen in the world. And there's a quote that we talk about a lot internally within our company, which is by Nelson Mandela, which is that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And we really believe that if it's open, if it's free, if it's accessible to every single person on the planet, and if you combine that with the core fundamental skills around curiosity, creativity, collaboration, thinking critically, and being able to communicate, which we believe are the most important soft skills anyone can learn, then just great things will happen. People will go out, they'll learn, they'll go out and create new things, and that is essentially how the world becomes a much, much better place. So in closing, what I would highly recommend for all you guys to think through is the only way that change could happen is for us to think about how to do it differently. And I really encourage for you guys to really think about the differences between education and learning and how we can unite the two back together. So thank you.
What a great story. Thank you very much, Mr. Michael Kansanapon. When your dream comes true, we educators may lose our jobs. There will be no more educators. There will be only learners. Because you suggest it is an innovator or a creator. We had a very, how can I say, interesting, inspiring, informative speeches. Would you all agree with that? And because of that, I realized that I do not have any questions coming from the floor in writing. So what I would propose is for the next 25 minutes or so, I try to facilitate the interaction between our two distinguished speakers and the floor. And before doing so, I have my own curiosity for our first speaker, Mr. Professor Rosenzweig. You talked about left brain and right stuff. If I understood you correctly, by left brain, some kind of rationality, reasoning, etc., and right stuff, versatility, and others. But what if we go for right brain and right stuff? From brain science, we learned that the function of right brain is different from left brain, right? So you don't have to answer right now. Think about it. For Mr. We have questions. Mr. Kansanapon, I think you did advise us, especially the young people in the room, about education and learning. But based on your experience, what would be your very specific one piece of advice to those young people in the room who want to follow suit in one or the other? the things that you have done so far. Okay, think about it. Now I have a couple of questions for us. So one for each. One question is about on stages of thinking about decision, what is the role of culture in the stage of thinking? This is for Professor Phil Rosenzweig. The next question for Mr. Michael Kanchanapon is, Skillshare is open that lets everybody to teach. Then what steps for people to teaching other people wrong factual ideas, such as social problems? I cannot. So far, we have 2 speakers and 2 questions. Plus, I collect 1 or 2 more questions. Please raise your hand. Tell us who you are, what questions or comments you have. I don't welcome speeches, but short and yet to the point kind of remark, question. I don't see any hands. You're not curious enough. Okay, so think about, okay, well, I have a gentleman.
네, 네, 감사합니다. 필 로젠드바이크 교수님께 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 번역서 하고요, 번역서에 관계된 거 하고 또 하나는 제가 질문지를 보내드렸는데 못 받으신 것 같은데요. 더 낮은 단계의 의사결정이 더 합리적이라고 판단할 수 있는 의사결정을 방해할 때, 예를 들면 민주주의 원칙이라는 이름으로 다수, 그러니까 더 낮은 단계의 의사결정을 하는 수가 다수를 이루는 경우에 그 경우를 그 카메라나 그 물건 사는 그런 소비자 심리에서 이미 설명을 하신 것 같은데 실제로 중요한 사회 문제에 있어서 의사결정을 해야 할 경우에 있어서는 예를 들어주지 않으셨기 때문에 한번 여쭤보는 겁니다. 그래서 더 낮은 단계의 의사결정이 더 합리적이고 더 사회 구성원에게 필요하다고 하는 의사결정을 방해하고 결국은 그 양적인 부분이 더 많다는 이유에서 그 합리적인 의사결정을 이루지 못하고 그것이 그 부결되었을 때 이러한 부분에 대해서는 어떻게 그 결정을 해야 되는지 이러한 부분에 대해서 한번 여쭤보고요. 또 처음에 드린 그 번역서 문제, left stuff 그 데타이한 부분, subtlety 부분이 그 반영이 안 된 걸로 저희가 그 번역서에서 보는데 혹시 앞으로 저서들 번역을 하실 경우에 번역가를 선정하시는 데 있어서 가장 그 주제를 소화해낼 수 있고 그리고 그 주제에 대해서 가슴으로 이해할 수 있는 그런 번역가를 선택을 하신다면 양적인 어떤 그런 사회적인 업종보다는 질적인 그런 그 접근이 가능한 이런 관점에서 번역을 한다면 그 원본에 대한 이해를 더 쉽게 할 수 있지 않나 이런 말씀을 드리고 싶습니다. 네, 이상입니다.
Thank you. Perhaps I should pause here and ask our speakers to respond, starting from Professor Rosenzweig. You have several questions, so I'm giving you the floor to respond or to answer the questions.
Well, okay, thank you very much. I have one question that I understood. If that was a question, I'm afraid I didn't understand it, so I'll need some translation. But I will answer this one that comes from, I think, Mr. Rahman. It says, stages of evolution. What is the role of culture in the stages of thinking? So it's a very good question. I think that when it comes to the work on behavioral decision theory about cognition, that tends to be very robust across countries. We have pretty much the same brains and we have pretty much the same heuristics. So one of the things that is very powerful in that work is that the findings tend to be applicable across. But when we talk about things like pushing boundaries, taking chances, doing things we have not done before, there I agree with the questioner, there is quite a role of culture. And there are cultures in the world that do reward taking risks, that aren't so bothered about failure, and there are others where it's very difficult to take risks because we're much more concerned about being different and standing out. And I will let you interpret for yourselves what the implications may be for some Asian cultures in particular, perhaps for Korea. And it relates very much to what Michael was talking about. He mentions many of these people in Silicon Valley and anybody can create and so forth. I think he's absolutely right. But what is very particular about certain cultural or institutional contexts is that they reward you for taking chances even if you're not successful. And so there is a very strong cultural element to that. I'm not saying that it's particular to one nation in the world. Even in the United States, the culture of Silicon Valley that you refer to is very different from the culture in some other parts of the country. But I think there is a strong social and cultural dimension here when we want to encourage people to take risks. So that would be my answer to this question. Let me come back to what was mentioned here about, right brain, right stuff. So this is where the title that I picked becomes maybe a little bit difficult. And that is, yes, there are differences between the left hemisphere of your brain and the right. But the people who've talked about left brain, right brain, I think most psychologists will say that is much too simplistic. In fact, both hemispheres of the brain work together for many things, even though the left side tends to be a little more rational, analytical, and the right side may be a bit more lateral thinking. But I picked the title for my book because the word right in English can mean two very different things. It can mean the direction right as opposed to left, or it can mean right in terms of being correct or good. And so the title works in English or in American because I'm using left to mean one thing and right to mean something else. But when we go to translate it, it becomes a little bit complicated. So that would be my answer there. While I have the mic on, I'm going to say one word about Michael's presentation. He began by talking about education as opposed to learning, and then at the end he came around to Mr. Mandela's quote where education was in fact this very good thing. So I think what he's getting at is that formal education, schooling, is not the same as how we learn. And there a quote comes to my mind from a well-known American writer and humorist from many years ago named Mark Twain. You may be familiar with him. But he had a very nice quote that said, "Never let your schooling get in the way of your education." Okay? Because going to school is one thing, and that's what I think you mean by formal education. But you learn in so many other ways beyond formal schooling. So school is all fine, but your learning, your true learning, goes beyond that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rosenzweig. Actually, you owe one more answer to the last commentator or lady from the floor, but I would suggest that after this session, you have an individual talk. That was about translation. It's not about the right stuff, but something about translation of your book in Korean language. So I would suggest that you talk to each other after the session. Is it okay? Now, Mr. Michael Kanjanapon, it's your turn to react or you answer.
For this question?
Yes.
So the question was, what steps?
Can you turn on the microphone?
Hello. So the question was, what steps do we take as a company to prevent people from teaching the wrong facts or ideas? I would say our stance on that is just pro-internet, pro-web. And I think what we mean by that is as long as we build the tools that allows the community to dictate what's good, what's not, very similar to Airbnb or eBay, those things will kind of just sift itself out and sort itself out. So we don't really do anything to prevent, I would say, anything along the lines of what's true or not true. We just provide the tools and give the community the ability to do that for us.
Thank you. By the way, sorry for my ignorance. The things that you do through Skillshare, is it something like what we call MOOC? Are you aiming at MOOC, or is already a MOOC?
I would say it's very similar in the fact that we're online and it's an online class, but there's a lot of distinct differences. I would say the first difference is MOOCs were set up for traditional education, so they took a lot of the curriculum and courses that were happening at all the top universities and moved them online. So we kind of look at that as a model that could not work, but they kind of had an idea of what worked in the real world, and I think I would argue that I don't know if it really works that effectively, and then they moved that online. And as many of you know, the internet is just a very different place. And what we did instead is, we looked at the internet and we said, how can we devise and design something that starts with how the internet works, and then weave in education into that. Oh. So all of our classes are really short. They're all project-based. It's all community-based in interactions and collaboration and projects, and I would say it's probably 20% lectures and 80% the community talking and working with each other.
Thank you for the clarification. By the way, the MOOC stands for Massive Online Open Courses, which is a new phenomenon on the internet and in higher education. So we have roughly 11 minutes before we close the session. If you have any burning questions, comments, again, I don't encourage speeches. Very short remark, question. Raise your hand. Pagarif. Microphone, yeah, here, yeah, microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I have a question for Michael. You are talking about different paths based on curiosity, and you also mentioned on collaboration. Do you think that the society, especially when the society goes to the trend of very individualistic society, collaboration is easy, or what is your advice to have a very positive and healthy collaboration? Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for your short question. Perhaps 2-3 more questions. I would like to see gender balance. This time I would give floor to a lady. If not, oh, okay, so young student, where, I cannot see from here. Okay, please. Yes.
Hello, my name is Ji-sung Kim from Hyundai High School, and I want to appreciate for your great speech. Okay, so I have a question to Michael. So you are talking about the necessary of the creative education, right? So I want to know what things we have to prefer, or the government policy to be preferred to improve the creative education. So I want to know your idea.
Yeah. I think I could combine all the questions into one.
Can you hold on, press one more comments question?
Sure.
If I may. I don't see any lady. Yes. So you'll be the final commentator. Microphone here.
네, 마이클 씨에게 질문을 하겠습니다. 그러한 일을 할 때 어려움이 닥쳤을 때, 어려움이 닥쳤을 때 어떻게 극복을 하는지요? 예를 들면 개인적인 뭐 습성이랄지 그런 개인적인 성향 이런 부분에 대해서 누구나 일을 하면 개인적인 습성이나 개인적인 어떤 성향 때문에 어려움을 당하게 되는데 이렇게 어려움을 당했을 때 어떻게 극복을 하고 있는지 한번 말씀을 해주시면 학생들에게 도움이 되겠습니다. 감사합니다.
고맙습니다. 제가 원래 의도한 바는 아니었는데 그래도 좋은 질문 감사합니다. Perhaps one more. The very last burning question. Yes.
I have a question for Michael. Actually, I'm a Waseda University dropout, and I kind of have a personal question. If you can go back to the time of, if you can go back to your graduation from your high school, and you have several options that you can study through Skillshare and MOOC and something like that, Coursera, and you can go to Virginia or Harvard or whatever that your parents really like, what would be your selection? What would you choose?
Difficult question. So, Michael, you are very popular. So I would ask Mr. Kanchanapon to react or respond, and then if Professor Rosenzweig, if you have any concluding remark or wrap-up remark, I would invite you. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and try to answer all the questions. And kind of combine them into a couple of key answers. I think I would have still went to the University of Virginia because I still had a Korean mom, so I don't think I had a choice but to graduate from college. But I would say, all jokes aside, I mean, to answer the question around collaboration, to answer the question of what I would have done differently if I would have graduated from high school, and the advice that I would give to someone in high school, and how they should view it, I think it's very different for every single person, and I think the only person that can answer that question is yourself around, what path you want to take. And for when I have kids, what I would love to see in the world in 10, 20, 30 years is lots of options. So when they graduate from high school, they could go to traditional university, they could complement that with something online. They could say that I'm going to actually fly out to Apple and learn from the industrial design team there because it's the best in the world, and they have a 6-month program for me, and I want to do that. Or they could say I want to travel the world, or they could say I want to volunteer. It almost doesn't matter, but it's the only thing that matters if they have lots and lots and lots of options. Which goes back to the question for high school. It's, if you feel like you don't have lots of options, and maybe the traditional system is taking a little too long. I think for where we are in the world today is that you can create your own options, you don't have to wait, or there are a lot of other people creating those options, and you can find those things and complement it with what you're already doing with your schooling. So maybe they won't teach you all those skills you want to learn, or maybe they don't offer it yet, but there are a lot of alternatives and options that you can either create yourself by continuously learning. And the beauty around that is we have the internet, so you can find anything, or you could create it yourself. Then to answer the question around collaboration, I think it's one of the most important skills that anyone can learn. And I think being an individual and having a very diverse view is really important. But being able to communicate, and we actually internally call it duking it out, having a debate, and picking the best idea and being able to communicate that. And once that happens, being able to work together as a team to achieve something that we can never do as individuals. And I think that's a really important key point when we talk about the skills that are needed for the 21st century and beyond. So to answer your question, I think being an individual and having a very diverse view is very important, but knowing when to combine that with a team to achieve something is even more important. But I think both are important as well.
Thank you, Michael. Now, Professor Rosenzweig.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of comments. One is, as our moderator said at the beginning, we're talking about different things, but in many ways they're very complementary, because what I'm talking about is decision-making where we choose to undertake things that have not been done before, which is very much the idea that is implicit in creativity. So I think in some ways they're complementary ideas, and both of them really presuppose an institutional or organizational setting that allows that to happen. And so if we think about what some of the takeaways are, either for your companies or for the broader society, the question is, what are we doing that allows people to be creative, to take risks, to do new things, as opposed to what prevents them from doing so. And that comes back to something else that we talk about at my institute, because at my institute we do work on executive education. And it raises the question, what is a teacher? What is a teacher? What is teaching? And we like to say that we think that what we do is we facilitate learning. So if your idea of teaching is standing up and lecturing, we don't really do that. But what we try to do is facilitate learning. And it comes back to something that Michael was talking about. You can sit in lectures and you can absorb information. But it's when you do projects, it's when we as teachers structure learning experiences that we find it's more meaningful for the individual and for the companies in which they work on. So my hope is that, I said some very different things than Michael talked about, but they're really getting at the same thing, which is in order to make progress, in order to come up with new ideas, to stretch boundaries, we have to enable people to take risks, to be creative, and we then have to provide the context and the support to allow them to do it, as opposed to discouraging it or punishing them or penalizing them if things don't go that well. So those would be my concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rosenzweig. Well, it has been very fruitful, very informative, productive exchange and speeches. So I'm not going to conclude, and I'm not going to summarize anything, but as a moderator, if you allow me, I would like to share what I think about all these two, important interconnected themes. Working for UNESCO and part of UN system, I think the ultimate goal or aim of UN system is to bring peace and security to the entire humanity, or to make the world a better place to live in. For that, we know how important it is to make a good decision, first of all, at individual, community, country, and global level. I certainly believe that good decision will lead to good results. For good decision, we need to better understand how we can arrive at better decision. With that, we can influence many others. So in Professor Rosenzweig terms, this decision at managerial or leadership level, I think is very important, because many people in the room are young people. I would say the future belongs to you, depending on how you decide now. That will shape 10, 20 years from now on in the future. Therefore, to arrive at good decision, I think we need to share our knowledge, skills. More than anything else, we need to become a good learner. With that, I thank you, everybody, for your participation, and thank you, our great speakers. Let's give them big hands. Thank you.